Is this right? I mean, a lot of times somebody carries this out for the speaker. But is this too? Yeah, I see. Okay, I'm gonna go make my entrance. Ladies and gentlemen, I present for you the formidable, the illustrious, the illustrative Diet Mountain Dew. A moment of silence. Yes, the Diet Mountain Dew. I admit I have a weakness. If you've only had to deal with me maybe in the lobby, you may have been fooled by my opaque emotional support water bottle. People will occasionally say, hey, you've got water in there? I'm like, yes, I do. I also have citric acid, potassium benzoate, aspartame, gum arabic, and calcium disodium EDTA to preserve flavor. More importantly, and this is verbatim on the bottle, not a significant source of saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, dietary fiber, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. Because, you can never be too careful. I was checking out at a grocery store once, and I was taking advantage of a sale price on the Pepsi products, which would include the mystical, the magical. And I was maybe carrying enough six-packs to draw some notice from the store manager. I don't know what they look for. And so my cashier is a young woman in her early 20s, I would say. And she looks at me and she says, that stuff will kill you. And I'm looking at her thinking, I've got socks older than you. And this is the stuff that's keeping me from jumping across the conveyor belt right now to make sure we expedite my order. Well, enough. Suffice it to say, I've been a big fan ever since it was legalized. And hey, it's keeping me off the hard stuff, like coffee. Yeah, you know who you are. We'll come back to that. Welcome to week 9 of our 10-part series on the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul. For your reading pleasure and education, we have a new insert. If you got one of the early fold-outs that had the map of Paul's missionary journeys and all that, this is an add-in. It's a single page, carries a little more information, so you can add to that. If you don't have one of those fold-outs, you can get one of those at the welcome desk, and they will already have the insert with them. But however you approach it, there's a fold-out, and then there's this insert. We want you to take advantage of that. Don't tarry, because the series is over next week, but we want you to avail yourself of that. This series on the Apostle Paul started in early June, with us on the road to Damascus, looking at his conversion experience. We examined how he transitioned from being a powerful Jewish leader to becoming the most influential Christian leader outside of Jesus Christ that the world has ever seen. We saw him stand before the Jerusalem Council to defend his goal of taking God's word to the Gentiles and making sure that they had the gospel message. Then we followed his travels and messages through 3 journeys that took him years to complete, but changed the forevers of countless lives and the generations that followed. And most recently, we've seen Paul under arrest in Rome, which is right in line, actually, with the goals that he had expressed of taking the gospel message all the way to Rome and thereby the ends of the earth, and also to the highest level of rulership possible in the world. Such an incredibly full life. How much more living can you cram into one life? And the answer in this instance is not much. For we are entering a period in Paul's life and Paul's ministry where he is decidedly and unquestionably preparing for his own death. Yet Paul's acceptance of this and even his eagerness is exactly why we are bringing this kind of a message to you today. Inasmuch as Paul's writings to the churches in the New Testament, and therefore his writings to us, teach us how to live and move and have our being in God. They offer us instruction on how to function as a church and as a church family, which is not always the easiest thing to do. his urgency to spread the gospel message across the whole world and not just to a select people group. He is able to successfully accomplish this in his ministry because he lives under a very specific set of fundamental beliefs. Paul is living an infinite life in a temporary world. It's rather remarkable to me how often a struggle exists to believe that Jesus, who was called the Christ, came into the world through miraculous means, did miraculous acts, bearing miraculous results, culminating in his own victory over death by resurrection. And apparently reading about that from those who witnessed it firsthand is not always sufficient. If only we could see video footage. But then you realize that you can't trust what you see in video footage, can you? Perhaps if each of us could get Jesus to come and perform these miracles for us firsthand, that would be sufficient to get past our skepticism. But to be honest, I doubt it, because we're fooled by a pretty good street magician. Yet one of the most powerful arguments for the credibility of the entire account of Jesus as being the Son of a living God who has a purpose and a desire for all of us is that so many of those who came into contact with him were dramatically and thoroughly changed to their very core. In their life's purpose, in the way that they thought, in what they valued over life itself, refusing to recant their beliefs, even to the point of their own deaths. And few can compare to Paul in this regard. Paul accomplished incredible, amazing, history-altering things. And if we look not only at his writings in 2 Timothy chapter 4, which we'll get to, but also in his earlier letters, we see evidence that he has this total understanding of his mission, that he has a very mindful purpose in what he is doing, and he understands all along where his path is going to lead him. There is no question in his mind. I believe that Paul was able to live this infinite life in a temporary world because his sense of mission was secured. Interestingly enough, Paul was the second person to know what his mission was. If you'll recall, back on the conversion experience as he's going to Damascus, he is struck blind and he is waiting for someone to come give him directions. He has been interceded with by Jesus himself on the road there. So God reaches out to a man called Ananias. And Ananias is not real keen on going and meeting Paul, whether he's blind or not. But God says to Ananias these words, "But the Lord said to Ananias, go, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and to their kings and to the people of Israel. And I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." I have to think that somewhere along the time they spent together, Ananias and Paul, that Ananias related this message to Paul. He might have gotten a little bit of satisfaction out of telling Paul that he had a lot of trouble coming down the pike, because Paul had been persecuting Christians up to this point, arresting them, imprisoning them, and supporting their executions. But by the time Paul writes to the church in Corinth, Paul appears to be totally sold out on this mission of his. In classic Southeast Americanese, the boy was ate up with it. He says this, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings." Paul's mission, in one word, was everyone. Everyone, everywhere, all the time. And he didn't say those things flippantly. He didn't just toss that around. No, he compares his efforts to the most intense, strenuous training This is great during an Olympic season. Paul says, do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? So run in such a way as to get that prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my own body, and I make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. The indication here is not that Paul is on some brainless joyride of faith, some tra-la-la-ing trip tossing out daisies, but he is pouring himself into this new mission, pushing his physical limits, pushing himself beyond what makes sense. He is beaten, yet he returns to the synagogue to teach again. He is shipwrecked, but he keeps getting back on boats for some reason. He is arrested, but he preaches to the guards until he's released, only to start preaching again in the streets. The 4th chapter of 2 Timothy is perhaps the most identifiable passage in which Paul can be seen giving his farewell address to the church and to his friends. It's like his last will and testament. And in it, he sort of bequeaths his mission to those who will come behind him, saying, preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season, correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. But you keep your head in all situations, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. I believe Paul was able to live an infinite life in this temporary world because Paul's mind was secured. They're giant questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? And why am I supposed to be doing it? Maybe you've gone through that passage of life, that rite, at some point already. Or maybe you're 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years into a career at this point, and you're still dealing with those questions. But Paul never deals with that existential crisis. I guess it does help when Jesus spotlights you from heaven and asks you embarrassing questions in front of all your friends. That kind of focuses things down a little bit. But Paul does his best to pass along, to convey this mindset, one that keeps him secured to his mission. He says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Keep at it because you know that your time isn't being wasted, he says. Then he says this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid his life down for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Because Jesus died for us, that's the cause with which we reach out to others. He says, if we are out of our mind, as some people say, it's for God. And if we are in our mind, in our right mind, it is for you. For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, therefore all died, and he died for all. That those who live should no longer live for themselves, but him who died for them and was raised again. Because his love cannot stop with us. He says, since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died. And your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Because Jesus raised us to new life. And finally, he says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. I believe Paul was able to live in an infinite life in a temporary world because Paul's martyrdom was secured. There is no question that Paul understood what his future held. I mean, I suppose to a certain extent we all do, ultimately, but Paul's experiences left him very aware that his demise was pretty likely much closer to him than it is for most. It was a bullet that he had been dodging for years, and he was making it through quite literally by the grace of God. He is quite transparent in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8 with these words. For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Remember just a few passages ago when Paul was running the race to win? He was boxing his earthly self to win disciplined faithfulness to God. Now, with the gasping breaths of an Olympic athlete who has just passed the finish line, he says that he has finished his race. He has fought the good fight, and he is now awaiting that victory crown. And for those of you who are so excited about the idea of a cruise vacation, when he says that the time of his departure was near, the word picture in that passage is that of a ship whose moorings are being loosened and released in preparation for leaving the safety of the dock and for setting sail across the sea. Or perhaps the thing that caught your attention was the phrase, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. Paul uses that phrase at another time earlier in his writings to the church in Philippi. A drink offering is one of those perhaps lesser known to us practices when it comes to Old Testament ceremonies for the Hebrews. And most of us have seen a picture or a depiction somewhere along the line of one of those burnt offerings. Maybe you've imagined what that must be like to take a steer, a full-grown steer, and to chop it up into pieces, to kill it, blood to be everywhere, to pile it on this blazing fire, turning it into ash, making sure that it is totally consumed as a burning sacrifice. But the idea of a drink offering is kind of odd for us. Pouring out wine on top of a sacrifice that has been made seems somehow wasteful, right? Somehow less substantive. There's not as much to it. It's just weird. Back in 2009, our son Caleb had finished his second year of university at Johnson University in Knoxville, which is a ministry, faith-based partner of WellSpring. We support them. And he had connected after that second year with a mission group out of Florida with whom he would be headed to the country of Chile for 2 months. Partnered with another young man to travel all across the country, speaking at schools and at churches and everywhere that would host them. Sherry and I were quite excited for him because we immediately recognized that the trip would play into his two primary areas of giftedness. One, no sense of direction, and two, easily distracted. And so I took it upon myself to start investing in prayer time over our son because I knew the trip would push him in some areas. And this is where the Diet Dew comes in. As he left, as we packed him into the van to take him to the airport to start this trip, I told him, hey, I just want you to know I'm going to be praying for you. And I'm not going to drink a Diet Mountain Dew until you're here again to drink it with me. And we got spotty reports from them as they were traveling all over the country. They really did an incredible job and just saturated as much as was within their power, talking about Christ, working that even into their school systems and being welcomed in that. And it was wonderful. And finally, he was coming home. And my wife and daughter realized I have no Diet Mountain Dew in the house. I didn't want to torture myself. I was doing quite a bit of thinking about that Diet Mountain Dew for those 2 months. You can imagine that I was no fun to be around. So the girls ran down to the gas station and they found a 1-liter bottle of Diet Mountain Dew, and they bought it and they brought it back. So we get Caleb and we bring him back home, and he's home for the first time. And I beeline into the house, kind of leave him behind. And I come out on the front porch and I've got this bottle of Diet Mountain Dew. And as he came closer, I stood on the front porch of the house and I said, "Son, I'm glad you're home." And most of all, I am so thankful to God that he brought you safely through this ministry time. So God gets the first drink. What a time. And I know it looks wasteful. It's not the way our brain works with our connection to God. It's a little bit unusual. But that act had kept me tethered in prayer for my son. That act had kept me thinking about and wondering about, where is he? What is he going through? How is his message being met? Is he safe? Or maybe even more importantly, is he effective? The Old Testament drink offering always came at the end of the sacrifice, always at the end of the ceremony. And if you can imagine that pile of meat, and maybe it was a lamb, maybe it was a ram, maybe it was a steer or a bull, but they would take that wine and they would waste it, and they would sprinkle it on the fire. It seems counterintuitive to be pouring a liquid onto the sacrifice fire, but they would pour it on. And every time it would hit, they would hear the sizzle, like a song of thankfulness to God. And it would burst up gouts of steam, and that steam would rise up into the air, which for the Hebrew sacrificer was evidence that his prayers, her prayers, were being met by God. The fact is here that Paul is not staring at his mortality. He is looking through it into immortality, without a doubt in his mind, without a doubt or a hesitation in his heart. Paul fears nothing that the future holds for him, even while he's in chains. The pouring out of Paul's earthly life comes as no surprise to him. In fact, he may have been growing unmistakably more and more aware with each step of his journey, seeing where it was leading him. I know Andy likes to go Bible nerd on you. I'm going to go Bible nerd on you a little bit. This is really cool. Remember back at Paul's conversion when God talks to Ananias? Do you remember what he tells Ananias is going to happen with Paul? Oh, yeah, he says, he's going to be his instrument. He's going to take the word to the Gentiles. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. But I bet you the words that are most important slide right through. But the Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim the name of the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel." And that's fine. But then he says this, "I will show Paul how much he must suffer for my name." And that's scary. That's not scary if you're not Paul. But if you're Paul, that's something to think about. It's like when you go to the doctor and they say, "This is going to pinch a little bit." No, that's not what that feeling was. That was not a little pinch. You lied to me. Let me do that to the doctor and see how the doctor describes it. It's not a big deal when it happens to somebody else. And we throw that verse away as we read about Paul because, Paul went through some stuff. We recognize that. Well, are you sitting down? This is going to be big. I have never heard this presented before, but from the author David Eastman, who wrote Paul the Martyr, he notes this parallel. Both Jesus and Paul go to Jerusalem despite a triple prediction that they would suffer there. Both receive a warm welcome and subsequently enter the temple where they are seized. Both then endure a series of 4 trials, during which they are handed over to the Gentiles, they are slapped, they are declared innocent 3 times, and subjected to a mob's cry of "Away with him." They submit themselves to God's will and are treated kindly and praised by a Roman centurion. And by the end of the accounts, both have fulfilled the preaching ministry given to them. Do you think that's random chance? that Paul gets to experience the walk of Jesus Christ. And I guarantee in Paul's eyes there would be no greater gift that God could have given him, no matter where it ends. It's pretty amazing, but it explains how Paul recognizes what the future holds for him and the pattern that his life will follow. He says, but even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and I rejoice with all of it, so you too should be glad and rejoice with me. The author of the phrase, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. It is not martyrdom that he faces. It is eternity with God that he faces. Michael Massimino tells his story on a podcast called The Moth, under an episode titled The Moon Landing Anniversary. As a 1984 college senior, Michael Massimino sat in a darkened movie theater watching a little flick called The Right Stuff. He was awestruck by the views through the window of John Glenn's spaceship, and he wanted to see that view, he decided, in person. His first stop after graduation was to apply to MIT, where he was accepted. As soon as he got accepted, he filled out that first application to become an astronaut and sent it in. And he got word back from them pretty quickly, and they said, no thanks. A few years later, as he was graduating MIT, he applied again, and this time he was rejected. So he applied a third time, and on the third time, they called him in for an interview, and they got to talk with him and get to know who he was. And then they told him no thanks. So he applied a fourth time. And in 1996, he received a phone call from the Johnson Space Center in Houston that started with, "Hi, Michael, how are you doing?" To which he replied, "Well, I don't know. I think you're going to have to tell me." And with that, he was accepted into the space program. 13 years later, he found himself as part of a team being tasked with repairing the Hubble Space Telescope. There was an instrument on the telescope that was used to detect atmospheres on distant planets to see if there might be other places that could conceivably host life. And the power supply on this instrument had failed. So for 5 years, his team worked and rehearsed and practiced the spacewalk at the Space Center. They designed more than 100 new tools to be used in this repair. Their goal was to gain access to a panel that was fastened down by 117 tiny screws, each secured with a locking washer. And just to be sure they didn't come loose, a little bit of glue. Mass, as he was known to his crew, was designated the repairman who would make the walk. It was unnerving, despite the thousands of hours of practice back at the Space Center. For part of the walk, there was no handrail at all to hold him into place, and he had to walk along the side of the telescope, hanging on to whatever he could get that was handy, while staring into a 350-mile drop to the world below. Mass makes it to the access panel, which is blocked by another section of handrail. So taking the handrail off, he undoes 2 screws on the top of that bracket, and they come off fine. In the bottom of the bracket, the 3rd screw comes off fine, but the 4th screw doesn't turn, even though the tool is turning. Mass had taken a common Earth-side problem and taken it all the way into space, one we know as the stripped-out screw. And Mass realizes that the handrail is not coming off, which means they won't have access to the panel with its 117 screws, which means they won't be replacing the power supply, which means that no scientists will be identifying atmosphere on other planets. Mass suddenly realizes that the legacy he is leaving his children will be, we would know if there was life on other planets, but Gabby and Daniel's dad broke the Hubble telescope. And now we'll never know. Mass looks back at his crew, and they have only shrugs to offer. He looks to the earth, that view that he had yearned to see for 2 decades, and there it was, right in front of him in all of its glory. But all he could think was, 8 billion people, and not a single one who can help me, as the dark and the cold of space begin to swallow him up. It occurred to me, I wonder what God sees when he sees the view. When he sees the big blue marble that he set spinning in space. I wonder if he says 8 billion people, and so many of them are distracted, and so many have no sense of direction. And all of them, every one of them, without exception, needs help. And I've sent the one who can help them. But the rest is going to be up to them. Taking it all into consideration, the Apostle Paul most likely died in Rome, beheaded during Nero's reign, either at this imprisonment or the next. Had his head removed during the first empire-wide persecution that Christianity experienced. I'm sure that Paul told his guards about the saving power of Jesus Christ. I'm sure that he talked to the executioner even while the sword was being sharpened to make sure that that executioner knew that there was someone who could save him, to save his life, if not on the earthly side of things, into the hereafter. And I'm guaranteeing you that Nero heard from the lips of Paul that there is one whose power is greater than any ruler on earth and who can save a life forever. And I have to wonder that as he went through the gates of heaven, as he approached the throne room of God, after that initial amazement and awe started to taper, I have to wonder if Paul just turned back and took a look and then returned his gaze to God's eyes and said, Father, I told them. I told them all. I told everyone that would listen. I tried to save as many as I could. And I have to think that God would look at him with love in his eyes and say, I know, Paul, I know. And you know what? You're still doing it. Good job. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, there are days when we look at the story of somebody like Paul and it's just another story between the pages of a book that is hard to read. But Father, I ask that your Spirit would start to wear through the defenses in our heart to understand that Paul's story might not be our story, but it needs to be. Because if we cannot accept the mission with the mindfulness of Paul and see through the end of this life into the victor's crown that waits beyond it, there are too many people in this world who will never hear the saving power of the gospel message that Jesus Christ died for all so that God could have them back, redeemed from our own sinfulness into a life everlasting. Father, place the weight upon our heart to carry the message and keep bearing down on us until we obey. In Jesus' name.